The night of our high school reunion was one of those chilly, end-of-summer evenings, with the faintest promise of autumn hanging in the air. It felt strange going back, reliving memories of a place that no longer belonged to me. The gym was decorated with old photos, our senior class banner hanging in a corner, and groups of people stood around, talking and laughing loudly, trying to drown out years of distance. My husband Johan was excited to see everyone again, but I could sense a subtle nervousness in him as we arrived. His hand held mine firmly, a little too firmly, as if reassuring himself, or perhaps reassuring me. But once we walked in, he seemed to relax, his eyes lighting up as he recognized old friends. I lost him in the crowd, finding a few familiar faces myself, and we ended up mingling separately for a while. I didn't think much of it until a few hours in when I saw him standing by the bar, talking with a woman I almost didn't recognize. She was tall, with soft, shoulder-length blonde hair, and a laugh that turned heads. Her name was Samantha, his first love. A memory of her floated back to me from years ago, a memory of them, arm in arm, as she kissed him under the bleachers. I swallowed, feeling a strange ache I hadn't anticipated. They talked like they'd known each other all along, the years melting between them. I was surprised by the tightness in my chest, an irrational jealousy I hadn't felt in years. Johan hadn't mentioned her to me in so long. It was as if he'd left her behind as we'd moved forward in our life together. But seeing them together, laughing, their faces glowing with familiarity, I suddenly felt like an outsider in my own marriage. After the reunion, I assumed it was a one-time thing, a polite reconnection, and nothing more. But weeks passed, and I noticed subtle changes in Johan. He was checking his phone more often, his face lighting up with each notification. One Saturday, he told me he was meeting some friends, something he hadn't done in years without inviting me along. I watched him leave, the same pang of doubt resurfacing, but I pushed it down, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, one evening, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I glanced down, catching the name Samantha before the screen dimmed. My heart pounded, but I didn't mention it. Over the next few days, he had more outings with friends, and each time he came home a bit later, carrying an energy he hadn't had in a while, a sort of thrill that made me ache with a longing I'd forgotten. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I confronted him, carefully and quietly, asking if he'd seen anyone from the reunion recently. His eyes met mine, and in that moment I knew. He didn't need to say it. His face gave everything away. After a moment, he admitted it. He'd met Samantha for coffee a few times, just to catch up, he said, but I could feel the weight of the lie between us. I didn't press further, though my mind spiraled with questions I was afraid to voice. Over the next few months, our marriage became an unspoken tug-of-war. He kept leaving for these so-called meetings with friends, and each time he left, I felt like a part of me unraveled. I couldn't stop thinking about how I'd missed it, the signs, the lingering glances at his phone, the extra cologne before he went out, the faint smell of her perfume on his collar. Each day, the reality of his betrayal settled deeper into my heart, carving wounds that words couldn't heal. I wanted to ask him to choose, to force him to end it, but I couldn't bring myself to confront the ghost of his past love. The days turned into weeks, and every time he looked at me, I could see a flicker of guilt. But he didn't stop. And I didn't stop waiting for him to remember that I was here, that I was the one who had loved him all these years. Eventually, the ache became a numbness, a slow acceptance that the man I loved had left me, even though he was still standing beside me. Months slipped by in a blur of lonely evenings and whispered conversations that I wasn't meant to overhear. I found myself rehearsing words, trying to find the strength to ask Johan the questions that burned inside me, but each time I opened my mouth, a knot would form in my throat, choking me silent. He was still here, still coming home to me, but he seemed like a stranger, haunted by memories I couldn't share. Johan's mood oscillated between lightheartedness and tension, and I saw his energy drain in ways I'd never noticed before. When he was home, his mind seemed somewhere else. I caught him once, staring out the window with a distant look, and when I asked him what was wrong, he shook his head, saying he was just tired. But his eyes gave him away. He wasn't tired. He was lost, caught between two lives, unable to leave either. There were times when he'd come back to me, really look at me with that warm, familiar gaze that I'd fallen in love with. He'd hold me close, whispering that he loved me, that I was everything he ever wanted. For a moment, I'd believe him, feeling the love and comfort wash over me like a warm tide, and I'd allow myself to hope. But it was short-lived. A message from her, a quick glance at his phone, and his attention would drift. I'd be left clinging to that fleeting moment, trying to hold on to him before he slipped away again. One Friday night, he came home later than usual, his face flushed, his shirt wrinkled, and the faint scent of perfume lingering around him. My heart sank as he quietly entered our room, his footsteps hesitant. He must have seen the look in my eyes because he stopped at the doorway, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Do you love her?" I finally whispered, the words breaking the silence between us like a brittle thread snapping. His face paled, and he opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, his throat working as if he couldn't find the words. A heavy silence settled between us, thicker and colder than anything I'd ever felt before. He finally shook his head, whispering, It's not that simple. Not that simple." The words echoed in my mind, cold and unfeeling, and I felt a wave of anger, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. How could he do this? Complicate our life, make it into something messy and hurtful, all for the sake of a past that had already passed. My mind reeled, trying to understand, but there was no logic, no answer that could make this pain go away. The days dragged on, each one more difficult than the last. I'd catch myself wondering where he was, what they were doing together, whether he was smiling, laughing, saying things to her that he'd once said to me. I tortured myself with these thoughts, unable to stop, until I felt like a shell of the woman I once was. Finally, one evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood in front of him, my voice trembling, but my resolve steady. "You need to choose, Johan. Either you end this thing with Samantha, or you leave. I can't keep living in the shadow of someone else's love." He looked at me, a mixture of shock and guilt etched into his face. He reached out, as if to pull me close, but I took a step back, needing to stand my ground, even if it tore me apart. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for this to happen. I thought it was just nostalgia, that seeing her again would be just a reminder of who I used to be. I didn't think." He trailed off, lost in his own thoughts, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I'd married, the man who had loved me with his whole heart. But it wasn't enough to soothe the ache. "Then choose," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, holding back the tears that threatened to spill over. He stayed silent, his gaze dropping to the floor, and in that silence, I knew his answer. He couldn't give her up. Not yet. Not until he'd chased that feeling to the end, whatever the end might be. That night, I slept in the guest room, lying awake, the pain throbbing through me like a heartbeat. I realized then that our love was no longer enough, not for him, and maybe not even for me. I needed something more, someone who could love me fully, and without shadows. For the first time, I began to imagine a life without him, free from the weight of waiting for a man who is no longer mine. Over the next weeks, we barely spoke, a cold truce filling the house. I started focusing on myself, building a life independent of him. I joined a book club, started running again, and found solace in old friends who reminded me of who I was before I became a wife defined by her husband's choices. Slowly, I began to find pieces of myself that I'd lost along the way, and though the nights were still hard, I felt a new strength growing inside me. Then one evening, Johan came to me, his eyes red and his face pale. He looked at me with a desperation I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that made my heart twist. "I ended it," he whispered, "with Samantha. I realized that none of it was worth losing you." But as I looked at him, I felt nothing but an empty ache. All the love I'd held onto for so long had been chipped away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. I couldn't forgive him. Not now. Maybe not ever. He had shattered my trust, and I wasn't sure I could put the pieces back together. "I'm sorry, Johan. I whispered, looking down, unable to meet his eyes. I wanted you to be happy. I thought I could wait, but I can't. Not anymore. And as I turned to leave, I felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that, for the first time, I was choosing myself. As I left the room that night, a strange numbness settled over me, wrapping me in a cocoon that muted the pain I should have felt. I walked to the bedroom I'd once shared with Johan, my movements mechanical as I gathered a few things. I didn't know where I would go or even if I was ready to leave, but I needed space to breathe, to think, to understand if there was anything left of us that could still be salvaged. When I returned to the living room, Johan was still there, his head in his hands, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him seem smaller, diminished somehow. It was the first time I had seen him look broken, and I realized he hadn't expected me to walk away. He'd thought I would forgive, that I would bend but never break, that I would wait for him to come back. Perhaps, in some part of me, I believed that too. But seeing him now, watching the love we once shared unravel like loose threads in his grasp, I knew we were past the point of easy forgiveness. "Are you really leaving?" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with a desperation I hadn't heard before. "I don't know," I replied, my voice steady but hollow. "I just need time. Time to understand what's left of us, if anything at all." His face contorted with anguish, and he reached out, his hand hovering in the air as if he wanted to pull me back, but didn't dare. I waited, wondering if he would say something that might bridge the growing chasm between us, but the silence stretched out, echoing the emptiness that had become our lives. I left that night, checking into a small hotel on the edge of town. It was a simple place, a far cry from the comfort of home, but the anonymity was a relief. The room was bare, almost clinical, with a bed pressed against one wall and a small desk beneath a window that looked out over the parking lot. I sat on the edge of the bed, my suitcase still by the door, and let the reality of it all wash over me. In the silence, memories came flooding back, moments from years of shared life. I remembered our wedding day, the way he'd held me close as we danced, promising me the world with that easy smile of his. I remembered lazy Sunday mornings, our laughter filling the house as we made pancakes, his arms wrapping around me as he whispered how lucky he was. I remembered the late-night talks, when we'd lie in bed and dream about the life we were building together. It felt like someone else's story now, a love that belonged to a different time, a different version of us. As the days turned into weeks, I stayed away from the house, burying myself in work and trying to build a life that felt my own. I found a small apartment downtown, close to the bustling cafes and quiet parks where I could disappear in a sea of strangers. It was liberating, in a strange way, to be alone. But there were moments, often late at night, when the loneliness would creep in, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. I'd lie awake, wondering if I'd made a mistake, if I'd left too soon, if perhaps he really could change. He called me almost every day at first, leaving voicemails that I couldn't bring myself to listen to. He wrote me letters, too. Pages and pages filled with apologies and promises, his words desperate and raw. He confessed his confusion, his regrets, how he'd let himself get swept up in a fantasy that was nothing compared to the reality of us. But the letters sat unread in a drawer, their ink blurring with tears I hadn't even realized I'd shed. Then, one morning, I woke to find him waiting outside my building. He looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed and his hair disheveled, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't say anything, just held out his hand, and in that moment, I saw the man I had once loved with all my heart, the man who had made me believe in forever. Against my better judgment, I let him in, letting him sit beside me in the quiet of my small, unfamiliar apartment. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Every part of my life feels empty without you." His words touched something deep inside me, rekindling a flicker of hope that I thought had died. I wanted to believe him, to believe that he could truly change, that we could somehow find our way back to each other. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew that something fundamental between us had shifted. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal easily, and though I still loved him, I wasn't sure if that was enough. "I don't know if we can go back," I said, my voice trembling. You shattered something in me, something I'm not sure can be fixed. We sat in silence, the weight of our words pressing down on us like a heavy fog. I wanted to reach out, to touch him, to feel the warmth of his skin, and remember the love that had once defined us. But the memory of his betrayal lingered between us, an invisible barrier that neither of us knew how to cross. Over the next few weeks, he tried to win me back, visiting often, bringing flowers, small gifts, trying to rekindle the intimacy that had once come so easily. He'd cook dinner for us, filling my tiny apartment with the aroma of our favorite meals, his smile tentative as he watched me. And in those moments, I almost let myself believe that we could find a way forward. But every time he left, the old doubts resurfaced, the pain and anger gnawing at me until I was left questioning everything. I couldn't shake the image of him with Samantha, the way he looked at her, the thrill that had been absent in our lives for so long. It haunted me, a constant reminder of the life he had once craved, the life he had sought outside of our marriage. Finally, one evening, as he stood in the doorway, his face lined with worry, I realized that I couldn't keep living in this limbo. I couldn't keep clinging to a love that had been tainted by betrayal, a love that no longer felt whole. I think it's time we let go, I whispered, my voice steady, but filled with a quiet sadness. He looked at me, his eyes widening, his face crumbling as he processed my words. Please, he begged, his voice choked with emotion. We can make it work. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I can be the man you deserve. But I shook my head, feeling a calm settle over me, a certainty that I hadn't felt in months. It's not just about what you did, Johan. It's about what it did to us, to me. I need to find myself again, to live a life that's free from doubt and hurt. And with that, I watched him walk away, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy as he disappeared down the hall. I closed the door behind him, a strange peace filling me as I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I was choosing myself. It wasn't the ending I had wanted, but it was the one I needed, the one that allowed me to begin again, to find a new path, a new love, perhaps even a new version of myself. In the days following Johan's departure, a stillness filled my life that was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. The silence was no longer suffocating. Instead, it felt like a blank canvas, waiting for me to paint a new picture of myself, my life, and perhaps, one day, my happiness. I moved around my small apartment like someone learning to live again, picking up old hobbies, exploring new ones, and filling the spaces in my day that used to be consumed by worry and pain. Gradually, my life began to take shape, filled with little routines and rituals that were all my own. I'd start each morning with a cup of tea by the window, watching the city wake up and feeling a little lighter with each sunrise. I read voraciously, getting lost in stories of love, loss, and redemption, finding solace in the idea that life could be rebuilt even after it felt like it had been torn to pieces. And I began exploring the city, wandering through streets I'd never noticed before, letting the vibrancy of the world around me seep into my soul, filling up the empty spaces left by Johan's absence. Yet, as much as I was healing, there was an ache that lingered, a phantom pain from the memories that still haunted me. Sometimes I'd see couples walking hand in hand, laughing and talking in a way that seemed so effortless, and a pang of loneliness would settle over me. I wondered if I'd ever be able to trust like that again, if love would ever feel as easy and natural as it once had. One afternoon, as I was walking through a small art gallery, I found myself drawn to a painting that seemed to echo my own journey, a woman standing alone on a beach, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her face a mixture of hope and sadness. There was something in the brushstrokes, the way her form was painted in soft, blurred lines, that felt deeply familiar, as if it was capturing my own struggle to find clarity in the messiness of life. I stood there for a long time, lost in the painting, letting it speak to parts of me I hadn't realized were still raw. That evening, I received a message from Johan. His name flashed across my phone screen, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But curiosity, or maybe some lingering remnant of love, compelled me to open it. His message was simple, almost tentative, like a hand reaching out into the darkness. "I hope you're doing okay," he'd written. "I think about you every day and hope that, someday, you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I stared at the words, feeling a complex mix of emotions rise within me. Part of me wanted to respond, to reassure him, to tell him that I was healing and that I wished him well. But another part of me felt that silence was the best response, a way of closing a chapter that had taken so much from me. I let the message linger there, unanswered, and slowly I felt a weight lift from me, as if releasing him from my life allowed me to fully embrace my own. As weeks turned into months, I began to notice changes in myself that I hadn't anticipated. I felt stronger, more resilient, and more in tune with my own needs and desires. My life no longer felt defined by the roles I'd played, as a wife, as someone else's anchor, as a person waiting to be chosen. Instead, I was learning to choose myself, to find joy in my own company, and to trust that I could build a future without the guarantees I had once clung to. Around that time, I reconnected with a friend from college, Emily, who had also been through her share of heartache and understood the pain of letting go. She became my confidant, and together we'd spend long afternoons at a small cafe, talking about life, love, and all the unexpected twists our paths had taken. She encouraged me to try new things, to step out of my comfort zone, and to see that life could be rich and full even after it had been broken. One evening, as we were sitting by the river watching the city lights reflect on the water, Emily looked at me, a soft smile on her face. "You're not the same person you were when I first met you," she said. "You're stronger now, braver. I think you've finally found yourself." Her words struck me, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of pride that I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. She was right. I had grown, and though the scars of the past would always be there, they were no longer wounds that held me back. Instead, they were reminders of everything I'd endured, proof of my resilience and strength. In time, I began to open myself to the possibility of love again, not the all-consuming, fairy tale kind of love that I'd once believed in, but something quieter, something that felt grounded and real. I took things slowly, learning to trust myself first and foremost, and finding joy in building connections that felt authentic and true. One day, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, I met someone new. His name was Ethan, a quiet, thoughtful man with a gentle smile and a way of making me feel at ease. We met by chance, both of us reaching for the same book at a local bookstore, and after a few laughs and a shared coffee, I found myself drawn to him in a way that felt natural and unforced. Ethan had his own past, his own heartaches, and as we got to know each other, we shared pieces of ourselves that we hadn't shared with anyone else. There was no rush, no need to fill every silence with words or every moment with grand gestures. Instead, we let things unfold slowly, allowing trust and affection to build in a way that felt safe and comforting. For the first time, love felt like something I could hold without fear, something that didn't demand all of me, but rather allowed me to be fully myself. Ethan understood my scars, respected my boundaries, and celebrated my independence. He didn't try to fix me or make me forget my past. Instead, he held my hand through the journey, walking beside me as I continued to rebuild. Months later, on a crisp autumn evening, Ethan and I found ourselves sitting in a small park, the leaves around us ablaze of red and gold. He looked at me, his eyes soft and warm, and told me that he loved me, that he admired the strength and grace with which I'd rebuilt my life. In that moment, I realized how far I had come, how much I had healed, and how much I had learned about love. Not just romantic love, but the love I had found for myself along the way. It was a love that had grown from the ashes of my past, one that would guide me forward with the courage and resilience I'd discovered within myself. And as I sat there, wrapped in the beauty of that moment, I knew that whatever the future held, I was finally free. Free from the weight of betrayal, free from the shadows of the past, and free to embrace the life that lay before me, a life that was mine to shape, to love, and to live fully. As Ethan and I grew closer, I found myself experiencing love in ways that felt new, uncharted, almost like discovering a forgotten language. This love didn't sweep me off my feet in a whirlwind of intense emotions or overwhelming passion. Instead, it felt steady, grounding, and quietly transformative, like a river gently reshaping its banks over time. There was a comfort in knowing that I could be fully myself with him, flaws, fears, and all. I didn't need to pretend, to constantly worry about whether I was enough. With Ethan, I was simply me, and for the first time in years, that felt like more than enough. Our relationship became a safe haven, a place where we could share our dreams and our regrets, our ambitions and our insecurities, without the fear of judgment. We spent long evenings curled up on his couch, talking about everything from our childhood memories to our deepest fears. Ethan told me about the moments that had shaped him, the losses he had endured, the people he had loved and lost along the way. And I shared my own stories, bearing the parts of me that I had kept hidden for so long. He listened with a quiet understanding that made me feel seen and valued in ways I hadn't known I needed. Ethan had a gentle way of drawing me out, encouraging me to explore parts of myself that I'd neglected for too long. He'd bring me books he thought I'd love, each one carefully chosen for a reason he'd explain with a quiet smile. We'd go to art exhibits and small jazz clubs, where he'd watch me take it all in, his eyes lighting up when he saw me inspired. One evening, after a particularly moving exhibit on resilience and recovery, he looked at me and said, "You have a strength in you that I can only hope to mirror. Watching you rediscover yourself is, well, it's inspiring." Those words stayed with me. It was the first time I'd felt truly appreciated for the journey I'd been on, rather than pitted or judged. With Johan, I had always been the one who stayed strong, the one who held things together. But with Ethan, I didn't have to be strong all the time. I could let my guard down, admit my fears, and still be met with respect and admiration. In his presence, I felt my self-worth blooming anew, a feeling I hadn't thought possible. As seasons passed, our relationship deepened in ways that surprised me. I hadn't gone looking for love when I met Ethan. In fact, I had been afraid of it, wary of the heartbreak that could come from trusting someone with my heart again. But Ethan showed me that love didn't have to be an all-or-nothing gamble. It could be built slowly, with patience and mutual respect, each moment adding a new layer of trust and connection. One rainy afternoon, as we sat together in my small apartment, Ethan asked me about my dreams, those wild, unreachable dreams I'd once held before life had weathered me. I hadn't thought about them in so long, those distant hopes I'd buried under the weight of marriage, betrayal, and rebuilding. But as I sat there, tracing patterns in the steam rising from my tea, I felt a surge of memories returning. I told him about the things I had once longed for, traveling, starting a small business, learning a new language. Dreams that had once felt far away, like they belonged to someone else. To my surprise, he didn't brush them off as whims or idle fantasies. Instead, he encouraged me to pursue them, to make plans, to dream out loud again. He even started researching ways to help me turn my ideas into reality, showing me that the life I wanted was within reach if I only allowed myself to believe in it. With his support, I began to step out of my comfort zone, slowly but surely reclaiming those lost parts of myself. I started taking weekend classes, signing up for workshops, and exploring interests I'd long abandoned. One of my dreams, one that had lingered in my mind for years, was to open a small bookstore cafe, a cozy space where people could gather, read, and find connection. The idea felt daunting, almost impossible, but Ethan stood by me every step of the way, helping me plan, budgeting with me, and listening to my ideas, no matter how big or small. Months later, I took the plunge, renting a small storefront in a quiet neighborhood, turning it into the warm, inviting space I had always imagined. Ethan was there through every step of the process, from painting the walls to picking out the perfect vintage furniture, his excitement matching mine. I watched the space take shape, a physical manifestation of my journey, of the resilience and growth that had come from my pain. It became my sanctuary, a place filled with books, soft lighting, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee, where people could come to lose themselves in stories, just as I had once needed to. The grand opening was a modest affair, just close friends, a few strangers who wandered in, and Ethan, who stood by my side with pride shining in his eyes. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the journey I had taken, and as I looked around at the cozy little bookstore I had built, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Later that evening, after everyone had left and the cafe was quiet, Ethan and I sat together in the empty shop, surrounded by shelves of books and the soft glow of dimmed lights. He took my hand, his fingers warm and familiar, and we sat in silence for a while, letting the moment sink in. "This place," he whispered, his voice filled with awe, "it's everything you are, strong, inviting, filled with stories and comfort. You created something beautiful from everything you went through." As I looked into his eyes, I realized that for the first time, I felt whole. Not because of him, not because of love or validation, but because I had finally reclaimed my life on my terms. The cafe, the friendships I'd nurtured, the resilience I'd found in myself, all of it was a testament to my journey, my choice to move forward and heal, no matter how long it took. Ethan stayed with me that night, our quiet laughter filling the empty shop as we talked about the future. And though the future remained uncertain, I no longer feared it. I knew that whatever came next, I would face it with strength, grace, and the deep sense of self-worth that I had fought so hard to rediscover. In the months and years that followed, the cafe became more than just a business. It became a place of refuge and connection, a space where people could find solace in stories, much like I had. I met countless people with their own stories of heartache and healing, and in each one, I saw a reflection of my own journey. It was a reminder that life, in all its messy unpredictability, was filled with resilience, growth, and second chances. Through it all, Ethan remained by my side, not as a crutch or a cure, but as a partner, someone who celebrated my strength and independence. Together, we built a life rooted in respect, trust, and a love that allowed both of us to thrive as individuals. Looking back, I saw how far I had come, from the pain of betrayal to the quiet triumph of rediscovering myself. I realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past or forgetting the pain. It was about growing from it, about building a future that honored my journey and allowed me to be truly, unapologetically me. And as I stood in my little bookstore, watching the world go by outside, I knew that I had found everything I'd been searching for. Not in someone else, not in the promises of love, but in the strength I had found within myself. As the years drifted by, my bookstore cafe became a cherished spot for locals, a place where stories were shared and friendships blossomed. I watched people come in, seeking something, a good book, a moment of peace, a brief respite from their lives. The regulars became like family, and in their stories, I often saw fragments of my own journey, reminding me of where I'd been and how far I'd come. Ethan was a steady presence by my side, his quiet encouragement the gentle push I needed to keep growing, even when doubts crept in. We settled into a rhythm, a life built on mutual respect and freedom, and though we never rushed toward any major commitments, we shared a bond that was as solid as any vow. He had a way of anchoring me without holding me down, of supporting me without overshadowing my independence. In him, I found a love that was generous and patient, one that allowed me to be fully myself without compromising. As the cafe grew, I started hosting weekly events, poetry readings, author signings, and even small book clubs that brought together strangers who quickly became friends. It was during one of these events, a cozy evening when the cafe was packed with people sharing stories and laughter, that I felt a tug at my heart, a deep realization of what I had built. This place, born out of heartbreak, had become a living, breathing space for connection and hope. It was a testament to the resilience that had carried me through my darkest days. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a new shipment of books, a familiar face walked in, a face from a past that I had long since left behind. It was Johann. He looked different, older, with a somber expression that contrasted with the vibrant energy of the cafe. For a moment, I froze, memories flooding back with an intensity one hadn't expected. But as he approached, I felt a calm settle over me, a quiet confidence that reminded me of how much I had changed. "Is it really you?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief and perhaps a hint of regret. "It's me," I replied, offering him a gentle smile. "Welcome to my little corner of the world." He looked around, taking in the shelves lined with books, the warm lighting, and the small groups of people talking and laughing. "You've built something incredible here," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I always knew you had this in you." I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me, a quiet pride that had taken years to cultivate. "Thank you," I replied, my tone soft but firm. "This place, it's been a journey." He paused, his gaze searching my face as if looking for something familiar, a connection to the person I had once been. "I wanted to apologize," he finally said. "I know it's been years, but I never got a chance to truly say I'm sorry. For everything." The words hung in the air between us, a gentle reminder of the hurt that had once bound us and the growth that had followed. I could see in his eyes that he carried his own regrets, that he had been haunted by the choices he had made. But instead of anger, all I felt was a profound sense of peace. "I forgave you a long time ago," I said, the words flowing easily, unburdened by any lingering resentment. "Not for you, but for me. I needed to let go to move forward, to build this life for myself." He nodded, a hint of relief in his expression, and for a moment, we stood in silence, two people who had once loved each other, who had shared dreams and heartbreaks, now standing on opposite sides of the journey we had both taken. After a moment, he took a step back, a small, bittersweet smile on his face. "I'm glad you found happiness," he said quietly. "It's clear that you're exactly where you're meant to be." As he turned to leave, I felt a strange sense of closure wash over me. There was no anger, no bitterness, only gratitude for the path that had led me to where I was now. Watching him walk out of my life for the last time, I felt as though a final weight had lifted, releasing the last traces of my past into the air. That evening, Ethan came to the cafe after closing, as he often did, bringing me dinner and helping me tidy up the space. I told him about Johan's visit, expecting a flicker of jealousy or discomfort, but Ethan only smiled, his hand reaching out to gently hold mine. "He was part of your journey," he said simply, "but you've created a whole new life from those pieces. That's something to be proud of." His words were a balm to my soul, and I realized once again how lucky I was to have found a love that didn't seek to possess or control, but rather to support and uplift. With Ethan, I was free to be fully myself, unburdened by the shadows of the past. He knew my story, knew the pain I had overcome, and rather than seeing it as baggage, he saw it as the strength that had shaped me into the woman I was. Over time, the cafe became more than just a place of business. It grew into a community, a safe haven for others who were, like me, navigating their own journeys of healing and self-discovery. I began hosting monthly workshops focused on resilience, bringing in speakers and authors who shared their own stories of overcoming life's hardships. It was both humbling and empowering to watch others find strength in the stories I helped bring to life. One day, a woman came into the cafe with a hesitant smile, clutching a small notebook to her chest. She told me she'd heard about the cafe's reputation as a place of healing, a place for people to come when they felt lost. I invited her to sit down, and over coffee, she opened up about the heartbreak she was going through, her voice trembling with the rawness of recent pain. I listened, offering quiet words of encouragement, and when she left, she hugged me tightly, thanking me for giving her a space to breathe, to just be. In that moment, I realized how powerful it was to hold space for others, to provide a place where people could feel seen and valued. The cafe had become a reflection of my own journey, a space where people could come to rediscover themselves, to find strength in their vulnerability, to rebuild. As the years rolled on, Ethan and I built a life together that was rich in love, respect, and quiet joy. We traveled, explored new places, and created memories that filled my heart with a warmth I hadn't known before. We never rushed to define our relationship with labels or timelines. Instead, we let it grow organically, trusting in the bond we had built. And though we never formally married, our commitment to each other was as deep and enduring as any vow. In time, the cafe became a place of legacy, a gift I could pass down to others. I hired a young woman named Sarah to help manage it, someone who reminded me of myself in my early years, determined, passionate, but still discovering her own path. Watching her grow, seeing her bring new ideas and energy into the space, was a reminder that life was a continuous cycle of growth and change, a journey that didn't end but rather evolved over time. As I stood in my cafe one crisp autumn morning, watching the golden leaves flutter outside the window, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a deep gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. I had built a life filled with love, connection, and purpose, a life that was truly my own. And though the scars of the past would always be a part of me, they no longer held me back. Instead, they had become symbols of resilience, reminders that I had faced life's storms and come out stronger, wiser, and more complete. I had learned that love, in its truest form, was not about possession or control, but about freedom, growth, and the courage to live authentically. In the end, my life became a beautiful tapestry woven from both joy and pain, from love found and love lost, from the broken pieces I had pieced back together to create something whole. I was no longer defined by my past or the people who had hurt me. Instead, I was defined by my journey, my choices, and the love I had found within myself. And as I looked out at the world, I knew that, whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it with an open heart, a fierce spirit, and the unshakable knowledge that I was, at last, truly free. Years drifted by, marked by seasons of growth, change, and contentment that I never could have imagined when I first left the life I shared with Johan. My bookstore cafe continued to thrive, becoming a cornerstone of the community and a refuge for so many. It was no longer just a business. It had grown into a place of shared stories and quiet revelations, where people found not only books but also parts of themselves they had forgotten or left behind. The cafe transformed over time, expanding into an adjoining space where we hosted workshops, open mic nights, and even yoga sessions. People gather here, not just to read or have a coffee, but to connect. Some came in from difficult marriages, some were mourning losses, and others were just starting out on journeys of self-discovery. Each of their stories reminded me of my own journey, the beginning so filled with heartbreak, and yet the ending, or perhaps this long middle, so filled with healing. One evening, after closing up, I sat at one of the small round tables near the window, a habit I had developed as a way to reflect. I liked to take these quiet moments, a last bit of solitude in the place that had become so alive with laughter, conversation, and the low hum of espresso machines during the day. Ethan arrived shortly after, bringing with him a calming presence that had become as much a part of the cafe as the warm lights and the scent of fresh coffee. He sat across from me, his hand reaching for mine, a familiar, grounding gesture. We spent these moments together, speaking in quiet tones or simply sitting in companionable silence. He had a way of filling even silence with warmth, and as I held his hand, I was reminded of how far we had both come, not just as individuals, but as partners who had grown into each other's lives with gentle ease. At some point that evening, as the rain pattered gently against the windows, Ethan leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said softly, "I've watched you build this life, brick by brick, from the ground up. It's been an honor to see you flourish, to see you find your peace." His words struck a chord in me, and for a moment, I felt a wave of emotion that took me by surprise. "You've been such a big part of that, Ethan," I replied, my voice wavering slightly. "You believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I don't think I'd be here, in this place, without you." We sat there, hands entwined, and I realized that, while I had done so much on my own, Ethan had been the quiet force that encouraged me to keep going. His love had been the kind that supported without smothering, the kind that allowed me to remain fully myself. I felt a surge of gratitude not just for him, but for everything that had led me here, all the pain, all the broken pieces, all the moments of doubt that had somehow, impossibly, created this life I loved. In time, Ethan and I decided to make our commitment to each other more tangible. We held a small, private ceremony in a sunlit meadow, surrounded by close friends, under the gentle gaze of the trees. It wasn't a traditional wedding, but it was perfect for us, a celebration of our journey, a quiet promise to keep supporting one another as we grew together. There was no grand reception, no elaborate fanfare, only a simple exchange of vows that felt deeply personal, as if we were speaking to each other's souls. Our life continued in much the same way afterward, unburdened by any expectations or rigid definitions. Together, we shared a love that was steady and sure, a love that respected the paths we had each taken to reach this point. We traveled when we could, discovering small towns and hidden gems, sharing new experiences that brought us closer with each journey. And in between, we returned to the familiar comfort of the cafe, a place that was as much our home as the quiet apartment we shared. Years flowed into decades, and in the meantime, life around us blossomed in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sarah, the young woman I'd hired to help manage the cafe, grew into a confident and capable leader. She became not just an employee, but a trusted friend and, eventually, almost like family. She took on more responsibilities, infusing the cafe with her own spirit and ideas, and even began organizing outreach programs, using the cafe as a platform for community-building projects. She brought a vibrancy and fresh energy that I could see would carry the cafe far into the future, and I knew that one day I would leave it in her capable hands. As I watched her flourish, I felt a quiet pride, not just in her growth, but in my ability to let go, to pass the torch to someone who could continue the legacy. It was a reminder of the cyclical nature of life, how we each play a part in something larger than ourselves, contributing to a story that will continue long after we are gone. One summer afternoon, Sarah approached me with a bright smile and a spark of excitement in her eyes. "I've been thinking," she said, "maybe it's time we open another location. There are so many communities that could use a place like this, a space for connection and healing. I think we could bring the spirit of the cafe to other places." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and though part of me felt a twinge of hesitation at the thought of expanding, I also knew that she was right. This place had become a home for so many, a place of belonging, and the idea of bringing that warmth to other communities felt like the natural next step. We worked together over the next few years, planning, designing, and eventually opening new locations. Each one retained the spirit of the original cafe, but with its own unique touches, reflecting the personalities of the communities it served. The cafe became a network of spaces where people gathered, healed, and found solace. It became a living testament to the power of resilience and connection, a reminder that even in life's darkest moments, there is always a path to something beautiful. Ethan and I grew older, and though time left its marks on us, our love only deepened with each passing year. Our days became filled with quiet moments of companionship, the simple joys of a life well lived. We took pleasure in the ordinary routines, sharing morning coffee, taking long walks, reading side by side in comfortable silence. We never needed grand gestures. Our love was woven into the fabric of our daily lives, each small act a quiet reminder of our commitment to one another. As I reached my later years, I found myself reflecting more often on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the heartbreak that had once felt insurmountable, the pain that had threatened to consume me, and I marveled at how life had transformed it into something meaningful. The scars of the past had faded, not erased but softened, becoming a part of the tapestry of my life. They no longer hurt. Instead, they served as reminders of the strength I had discovered within myself, of the resilience that had carried me through. One evening, as Ethan and I sat on a bench overlooking the river, the sky painted in hues of pink and gold, I took his hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice filled with gratitude. He looked at me, a soft smile touching his lips. "For what?" "For helping me find my way. For being there, even when I didn't know where I was going." He chuckled softly, his eyes warm with affection. I think you always knew where you were going. You just needed a little reminder. We sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and I felt a profound sense of peace. My life had been filled with twists and turns, moments of joy and heartache, love lost and found. But in the end, it had led me to a place of fulfillment, a life rich with meaning, connection, and love. And as I sat there with Ethan, hand in hand, I knew that I had lived fully and deeply, embracing every moment, every challenge, every triumph. My story was one of resilience, of finding beauty in brokenness, and of discovering that the most important love we can ever find is the love we hold within ourselves.